Okay, well, it's good to see everyone. I wasn't sure, it's a summer day and the world has gone crazy and there's protests and there's just so many different things that are requiring our attention right now. So I just want to say I appreciate you all coming to have this study, because even though it's not directly related to what's going on, I can see a lot of ways that it's indirectly related. And so I'm happy you all are here for us to expand our knowledge and see how we can use our faith to challenge these systems that are unjust for so many.
Are we protesting any place in Indiana right now?
Yeah, there's a sit-in going on downtown. And so the book that we're primarily talking about today is Elaine Pagels' The Gnostic Gospels. So DJ couldn't find it. And so what I did is in my notes, I kind of put I did an overview, and then I put each chapter, what the main question of the chapter was, and then I kind of put my little interpretive summary of what the answer was from each chapter. So I'm going to go through these notes with you, and then I'll have questions. So it's not going to be just me talking all the time. It's just me basically giving you some bullet points so that we can have discussion. But one thing that is good about what you brought up, Benita, is in the early Christian church, before it was established as like a foundation, hierarchy and all of the religion itself, it was very diverse. So it's actually a perfect time for us to study the diversity of early Christianity, because now we've circled back to being very diverse again. So the key differences that she kind of lays out between the early Gnostics versus the Orthodox ideals, and this she kind of talks about in the introduction of her book, are that essentially Orthodox Jews and Orthodox Christians insist that God is wholly other from humans. That means there's no humanity within God. God is a totally different entity up there, out there, somewhere else, but is not human. Where Gnostics say that self-knowledge is knowledge of God. Thus, the self and the divine are identical. So that could be challenging for a lot of Christians, because it kind of makes it sound like we're God also, but they don't necessarily mean it in the sense of you are God, but you have God within you. And that's more what they're saying. And the way they interpret Jesus in the Gnostic text, this is one of the second differences, is in the Gnostic text, Jesus's teachings are more about illusion and enlightenment, not sin and repentance, like the canonized New Testament scriptures about Jesus. In the New Testament version, Jesus comes to save us from sin, whereas the Gnostics say that he comes to be a guide who opens us to spiritual understanding, and that when the disciples attain enlightenment, they become equal to Jesus. So you can understand why that would be shocking, considering that we mostly have adopted the Orthodox view, right? The third thing is that Orthodox Christians believe that Jesus is Lord and Son of God in a unique way, forever distinct from us. But then in the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, Jesus basically says that we all come from the same source. And so scholars who have kind of interpreted this have sort of interpreted that living Jesus is sort of like living Buddha. And if you studied Buddhism, then that makes a little bit more sense. And that that because of that similarity, the Gnostics could have had some of their religious influence from Hindus and Buddhists of the time, because, with the trade route, there was some influence between the cultures. However, there was also the idea that over time, spiritual ideas have emerged in multiple places at a similar time without necessarily having crossed paths. And so for me, that says a lot about divine revelation, that God is revealing something to us, maybe to us here in the United States, maybe to someone else in China, maybe to someone else in South Africa, someone else in Peru. And we come to it at the same time because it's divine inspiration. And then, other people would call that universal truth. I mentioned last time that some of the earliest Orthodox church fathers all kind of were against the Gnostic faith. And as we know, there's a lot of people who are Christians today who also have a similar kind of exclusive view of Christianity. There's some Christians who say that you can only go to heaven if you confess that Jesus Christ is the Son of God who was crucified and raised from the dead in 3 days physically. So basically that's the creed, and that's what was established over time under the Orthodox Church. That was kind of established, but what this book does is it kind of breaks down the various things that make up the creed, because the questions that we want to ask ourselves is, as we mentioned last time, these texts remain hidden for 1,600 years. And as Jill mentioned last time, the fact that they were so well hidden shows that they were important at the time and they were in threat of being eliminated. The questions that come up for me, for example, is why was there such a movement to exclude those texts? Why were those particular fathers chosen as the founders of the church? By whose authority other than their own? Who decided which texts were acceptable to be part of the biblical canon? And what made Gnostic and other heretical texts so terrifying? Do you all have any thoughts about why those questions, or how those questions might be answered?
I had never ever thought about that in that light before, so I'm an open book.
Well, I think
Feed me.
the little bit that I understand is, obviously one is the patriarchal church itself, and any reference to women having a significant role was pretty much squashed. There was a move to have a very uniform view, so anything that did not satisfy the narrative would be eliminated. And some of the books, if you read, they do have some fantastical elements in them and were classified more towards mysticism.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you could look at some of the miracles in the books that did make it in, and you could look at that as being pretty extreme. So,
right. That's a very good interpretation. And that's true. I mean, if you think about it, having Christ crucified and rise again from the dead in 3 days, that's pretty spectacular as well. So, and that's included. So, when we're talking about mystical and magical sort of things, there's still an element of that in what remains in the New Testament. Carol, did you start to say something?
No, I was just thinking, I think you mentioned last time, you're trying to, I think you mentioned something about they were including stuff that fit the narrative that they wanted to present. And so I guess for me, my question is, what is that narrative that they were trying to present? What did they exclude that would have gone against that narrative versus what did they choose to include? And so I guess I'm coming out for more of the questioning sense, because I don't know what the narrative, I don't know exactly what the narrative is they were trying to craft.
Those are perfect questions, because that's exactly what the book goes into. Like, why? So I asked those questions, and then the book basically asked those questions as well. So some of the things that the Orthodox found threatening about the Gnostic views, this is more from her introduction, and then we'll go into each chapter, included the Gnostics wondered if all human suffering and death was truly attributable to sin, whereas Orthodox claim that absolutely, that human sin destroyed God's perfect creation. The other thing is kind of what Jill was alluding to. The Gnostics attributed masculine and feminine attributes to God, whereas Orthodox attributed only male. Gnostics tended to view Christ's resurrection figuratively rather than literally, like the Orthodox. And so the case that Elaine makes is that these religious arguments, if you take them outside of the context of life, it's one thing. But when you look at how religion has influenced our social and political and entire existence, you see that it's not just a religious debate. It's a debate about power. It's a debate about who has it, who doesn't, who's right, who's wrong. And there are very real political and social implications that happen based upon who controls the narrative and who decides who is Christian and who isn't Christian, who is acceptable to God, who is not acceptable to God, what does God want us to do, what does God not want us to do. So the way that people have taken power in the name of God is the real reason that we want to kind of delve into the debate that they were having in the beginning of Christianity, which is, as I said before, is relevant to our debate about Christianity today and how it's imploding our systems and exploding them, supporting and not supporting. You know, we have all these different sides of Christianity when it comes to what's happening into our world. In chapter 1, her first question kind of tackles the literal view of Christ's resurrection. And she asks, why does that matter? Why does it matter to Orthodox founding fathers if Jesus literally resurrected or did not? And what she claims is the New Testament actually supports both literal and figurative views of the resurrection. You know, if you look at the different Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they have different accounts of, you know, whether Jesus was physical in body or was like an apparition. So both can kind of say, no, it was a literal resurrection. The other can say, no, it was figurative because Christ did not come back in Christ's physical body. So was it an actual resurrection?
Amy?
Yep.
Is one of the reasons in that, I think I read in the past, was that all tied into the fact that they were trying to differentiate Jesus as divine versus having association with being of men, I guess, if you will? Is that part of why that was such a literal significance for them?
I think so, yeah. I mean, there was a lot of different reasons, but I do think that that was one of them.
Okay.
Because they wanted Jesus to be the Messiah that had been prophesied.
But is that too why they have the Mary's birth as being
Virginal?
virginal, yeah.
I think so, yeah, because if she wasn't a virgin, then they could have said that, well, how do we know that this is God's child? You know, if she was a virgin, then they could have the kind of like the idea that it was actually God who impregnated her. Whereas, right. I mean, but if it's technical, God can use anybody in any way, and that could include using the son of Mary conceived by another man and still make that person the son of God. You know what I'm saying? And still use Jesus in whatever way God wanted to use Jesus.
Right. I agree.
And interestingly, for Orthodox, you know, in Catholic Orthodox, there's still the level of sexism because they say that Mary is the mother of God, as opposed to, not saying that Mary is God, but they can say Mary is the mother of God, but they cannot claim that God is also mother. You know, that, so that's another thing that we'll get into too, is the gender roles and how the Gnostics believe it's mother and father, not just father. Basically, when we talk about another thing that she talks about as far as why they would need a literal resurrection, is very fascinating because it's basically a way to assert that Peter, the first witness of Christ's resurrection, is therefore entitled to take over and direct the church going forward. So does anybody notice anything strange about that statement?
Jesus didn't have a church.
Well, I mean, he had followers, and so
Followers, yeah.
Peter was, the early followers of Jesus would have been considered the church at that time.
Because what I see that does not fit is the two Marys were there as well.
And were first.
Yeah, it depends which version you read again, right?
Yeah,
Or did Peter get credit because they went and got him?
I think Peter got credit because they went and got him, and then he sort of took over from there because it still was a patriarchal time. So men's voices, you know how it happens today, like a woman says something and then a man repeats it and the man is brilliant.
Hey, I've been married 58 years. Believe me.
You mean the
got that
Matilda,
right.
They call that the Matilda effect.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Basically, in what she's saying that because it was literal and Peter could then say that he was the first witness, this would also galvanize the believers, because you have to remember that all sides agree that Christ was crucified, right? Like there's no one who's in disagreement about that.
Yeah, he was either a criminal or he's God.
Right. And the believers all believed he was God, but they still were in disarray after he was crucified, because here they're following this man who they believe is God and who has the answers, and then the empire kills him. And so a lot of the confusion about, well, what do we do then? Christ said that the kingdom is within us. Christ is to love your neighbor as yourself, and that the new way is coming, but now Christ is killed. What do we do now? So Peter, in his taking over the authority of having seen him resurrected, then gives a different kind of hope and galvanizing of people to still come together and still be the body of Christ, even though Christ was crucified. So part of it is that, a literal resurrection is more galvanizing than, but your spirit goes here and you still have influence in the world and you can still bring love. People like something more physical than mental or spiritual.
Wasn't Mary, the mother of Jesus, pretty active in the early church too?
Yes.
And then in the very early movement post-resurrection or whatever, and that would bother Tertullian and his crew.
Yes. They were very bothered by women. They called them foolish, for one thing. So the thing that I found strange about that is that they use the literal resurrection so that Peter can take authority over the church and lead Christians into the future. Not that they're called Christians yet, but, the believers of Christ leading them into the future.
Yeah.
But it was Mary that saw first. And so that's why the Gnostics are not so keen to dismiss her, because some Gnostics even say that Mary Magdalene was Jesus's, the beloved one, that they always attribute to John, that was actually Mary Magdalene. And so in one of the Gnostic texts, it's the Book of Mary. And Mary is the one that Jesus has given secret knowledge to, not John and not Peter. So a lot of the resurrection talk, according to Pagels, is that it was so that Peter would be the leader of the church, and for the Orthodox, that the lineage of people who ruled the church basically would be men who were basically apostolically instituted after Peter. I don't totally understand how they determined this lineage, but it basically allowed for the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And in that, I'm going to save my commentary to chapter 2, because that's sort of like the point of chapter 2. And in that, her question is, why was it crucial for the Orthodox Church to establish one God, one bishop? Does anybody have any guesses that they want? Okay.
Well, I think, weren't they trying not to, they were trying to establish, I don't know the way to put it, a standard, I guess, versus, you know, the Gnostics were a sect, you had the Essenes that were a sect. I mean, there were so many varied sects. Weren't they trying to, you know, kind of coalesce that into one more or less standard, or one unified, I should say, I'm sorry, I'm stumbling to try to come up with the right word, but I guess a unified message and narrative, I guess. That's what I'm trying to say. And you can only do it with one leader to unify, you know, the church under one.
Right. Where the Orthodox and the Gnostics differed about that, and that's actually a future chapter too, Jill, like what is the true church? And she talks a lot about what you just said, that it was trying to make it universal. But in the case of one God, one bishop under monotheism, basically Irenaeus's complaints against the Gnostics were that they claimed that there was another God besides God the Creator. And there's some Gnostic texts that explore very different versions of Genesis, and that the world was actually birthed from Sophia's fall, because she was looking for the highest God, and it was a council of gods. And so it's very, very different from our interpretation, right, of how we have it now. The Orthodox wanted to simplify it, you know, one God. But Genesis itself complicates that, because in chapter 1, verse 27, God says, let us create male and female in our image. And so the Gnostics are like, well, that implies to us that there is more to God than just one entity. And they don't necessarily believe in multiple gods, but they are asking the question, well, who are the other people then? Because then the other thing happens. So that's in Genesis chapter 1:27. But then after, you know, Eve eats the fruit and the serpent, you know, is the one that convinces her. So what the Gnostics are saying is that the serpent was wisdom, and that Eve and wisdom were essentially taking humankind into a higher spiritual plane, that it was actually an act of maturity, not sin. So I'm just letting that sit with you guys. And that why was God withholding the tree of knowledge? And so then, you know, in the Genesis story that we read, in chapter 3, verse 22, God says, Adam has become like one of us, knowing evil and good. So again, who then is us?
Mm-hmm.
So Valentinian was one of the Gnostic kind of writers and theologians, kind of the way Irenaeus and Tertullian and all them are on the Orthodox side. Valentinian was one of the big writers of the Gnostic. So he's not saying that God is multiple people, but what he is saying that God is unknowable. Basically, there's like a lot more mystery. And so the reason why the Orthodox were so desirous of to be one God who's in charge is because then, you know, in the succession of bishops, you know, that we talked about with Peter being the leader of the church, that if God alone rules all things, thus bishops, fathers of the church, must rule all things in God's name. So this basically puts clergy above everybody else, because we're, clergy are the ones that are telling you what God wants you to do. So spiritual authority in that case becomes actual authority as well. Instead of just interpreting people's spiritual journey, you're actually saying, I'm the one who tells you how to live. I'm the one who says what you do. I'm the one, because I'm speaking for God. So, I mean, nothing could go wrong with that, right?
Nothing did.
Not at all. Nothing horrible happened because of that. And then Ignatius, so Clement also, so Irenaeus thought that, Clement thought that, and Ignatius took it a step further to say that the hierarchy of the church represented the hierarchy of heaven. And so that meant there's one God in heaven and there's one bishop on earth. And so in our case, the bishop is the Pope, right? And in heaven, God rules over the council of heaven, just like the bishop rules over the priests, who rule over the deacons, who rule over the laity. That, to me, again, when I read that, I hear, how do we get power? And so there's a vested interest in defining God in that way, because it helps secure their human power structure on earth. And so for me, any spiritual question has to be accompanied with what actual reality is created because someone believes that, and who is it ultimately benefiting? Is it truly benefiting God and the people, or is it a narcissistic, ego-driven sort of thing that says, I want to be in charge, I want power, I want everybody to behave like I think they should behave? So those are the questions. That's not my answer, but that's what comes up when I read that. Like, that doesn't necessarily sound like God.
Back up for me a minute. The spiritual question, like if you went to your pastor or priest who was the authority, and you go to them with a spiritual question, and he has the answer as you're talking, that comes directly from God. So in other words, the priest was set up to control the whole structure. No wonder he couldn't get married. He didn't have time for anything else. I mean, right. It just, I mean.
So for any human being to say, I speak for God, is a level of arrogance that is dangerous. And I mean, I think the Protestants, that's kind of one of the big problems that Protestants had with Catholics, after Martin Luther, is they were saying, you don't speak for God. You don't get to decide who is forgiven for sins and who isn't, because of who gives the best tithes, or, there was a whole bunch of stuff going on. But basically Protestants are saying, no, we can have a direct relationship to God. So now we're getting to the question of, why was God in Orthodox exclusively father and male? The one thing she pointed out in this chapter is that in all of the religions of the world, the most patriarchal and male dominated imagery are in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the Abrahamic faiths. And all of the rest of the world have female imagery for God also. But the thing that's interesting about that is that the Near Eastern religions were the religions that started, that the Abrahamic ones came out of, and all of their original images of God were female. And you probably know this from archaeological studies, Jill, but all of the earliest replications of God and images of God, they were all female. And it makes sense.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I think the representation that you find through several early civilizations was Ashtar, and I think that was, if I'm remembering right, but that was the representation, that the goddess or God, Ashtar, the equivalent of God.
Well, and you always saw them, they were always like, usually they were naked and like well endowed, you know, because they were life givers, right? And so the fact that women can carry life, birth life, feed, and nourish all within our body, it makes sense that God would be woman in the sense of being life-giving. So, you know, it's interesting that now we always are like, God, he said, you know, over and over, it's always father, even though the mother is a much stronger God image. But there's still, even in the Jewish and Christian faiths, there is still female imagery. It's just not as dominant as the male imagery because they were patriarchal cultures. But, you know, there's some passages that talk about God as mother hen, and Sophia wisdom is God, is female. But in Orthodox, though, they call it the Trinity, right? But they say God the Father, the Son, and the genderless Holy Spirit.
Right.
But really, it makes even more natural sense to say God the Mother, God the Father, and the Son. You know, if you're going to go with a Trinity, why can't it be God the Mother, God the Father, and God the Son, right? It's so, and in the Greek, specifically, the language for the Holy Spirit is genderless. But actually in the Hebrew, it's Sophia, wisdom, which is female. So in the early Judaism, it is putting a gender, a female, associated with God too. So even in the traditional texts that are more patriarchal today, there is still an acknowledgement that there is feminine in God. So, you know, the traditions have taken the feminine out of God more than the texts themselves have. And again, why does that happen? Because they were patriarchal society, women didn't have power. So for God to give women power, for God to be female, would basically erase the claim that men are superior and should always lead. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. Now, the fourth question was we kind of touched on it already, was that all agreed that Jesus was crucified, but they all kind of disagreed about what that meant. And so for chapter 4, I'm just going to read the last paragraph and then kind of talk a little bit about it. So finally, in its portrait of Christ's life and his passion, Orthodox teaching offered a means of interpreting fundamental elements of human experience. Rejecting the Gnostic view that Jesus was a spiritual being, the Orthodox insisted that he, like the rest of humanity, was born, lived in a family, became hungry and tired, ate and drank wine, suffered and died. They even went so far as to insist that he rose bodily, as in physically, from the dead. Here again, as we have seen, Orthodox tradition implicitly affirms bodily experience as the central fact of human life. What one does physically, one eats and drinks, engages in sexual life or avoids it, saves one's life or gives it up, are all vital elements in one's religious development. But those Gnostics who regarded the essential part of every person as the inner spirit, not the physical experience, they dismissed such physical experience, pleasurable or painful, as a distraction from spiritual reality, indeed as an illusion. No wonder then far more people identified with the Orthodox portrait.
No wonder.
Sorry, I was just wondering what that was. Than with the bodiless spirit of the Gnostic tradition. Not only the martyrs, but all Christians who have suffered for 2,000 years, who have feared and faced death, have found their experience validated in the story of the human Jesus. So basically, the disconnect there is like Gnostics see the spiritual as the primary, and Orthodox see the physical as the primary. And that would make sense that people would prefer the Orthodox view, because humanizing Jesus is comforting. Believing that God actually came and experienced human life from birth and death and all of the things, that is Jesus suffering with us and in a way that makes it bearable for us in our suffering. Whereas what the Gnostics were saying, it's kind of like today people who are too intellectual or too like in their minds, or they have a lot of privilege and so they don't have to worry about the day-to-day physical stuff, so they're more philosophical. It's sort of where Gnostic kind of clashes with Orthodox in that way, because it's more, in the spiritual, they're saying that basically life is something that we overcome in order to get to the spiritual, because the spiritual is the actual experience and that the physical is just part of our journey. So, there's ways to find comfort in that too, but I mean, I would definitely agree that it's more comforting to see Jesus and God as human, who really understands us. And the spiritual, I believe that the spiritual does matter, and it does take us into, the future, beyond our physical selves. But when you're human and you're in the midst of physical experience, it's really hard to put a non-physical reality above what we're physically experiencing. Like, our existence matters to us. Our bodies matter to us. Our being able to eat and drink and procreate and all the things all matter to us. And so to have those kind of written off, that could be a little off-putting. What do y'all think about that?
I kind of agree with that, because I think, like you said, if you can identify with Jesus, who actually lived a life like us, or similar, obviously, but had the experiences and understood the same pains and suffering and happiness and all of that kind of thing. I think you're right. It's more comforting to have someone to identify with that, but yet the spiritual is what you're aspiring to be. His spiritual divinity, if you will, is where you're modeling yourself after. But I agree, it makes it easier to have it as someone that you admire and that you want to be like, if you will, if you want to equate it to, a more earthly experience. It would be like someone that you admired and the being that they are and actions that they take and that sort of thing. That's kind of the way my Jesus image is. It's somebody I could feel like I could sit down and have a conversation with and would completely understand and get me and be someone that I admire and still want to be and emulate. So yeah, I can see the two. I mean, I don't have any struggle with the two, spiritual and the physical, being of a human being.
Right. DJ, you look like you want to say something.
Oh, I was just thinking that I feel more comfortable following someone who I look at as having been human than I would being a spirit, because I don't think I would ever feel like I could measure up to the spirit, even though Jesus was way beyond my level. Most humans, all humans, but I feel more comfortable with that version. I maybe can at least strive more to achieve more of what he was, or wanted us to become, I guess is a way of putting that.
Mm-hmm. And I do think that the Gnostics still believed that Jesus was human, but what they kind of saw Jesus more as like the key to understanding a higher spiritual truth.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
think it just didn't matter to them as much that Jesus experienced the physical stuff. They just they prioritized Jesus's role as being more of a way to realize the spirit within us and to live more fully in life as we're kind of going on. But that's where Gnostics were kind of different. Like some actually like rejected physical experience, which is weird. That's my technical term. It's weird. But they still knew that they existed in the world, right? And they still had hunger and thirst, and they still lived their lives. But they were more about taking it to the next level, and they believed that Jesus kind of showed them how to find the cures to what ails us, which is a more spiritual journey, an internal transformation rather than historical events. Then in the 5th chapter, the question she's asking is, whose church is the true church? And interestingly, both Orthodox and Gnostics thought that they were the true church. And it seems like what the biggest difference is that, and this kind of goes back to what Jill was saying, it's that the church, that the Gnostics, to be a true believer, they basically saw that in the evidence of your spiritual maturity. Whereas the Orthodox lifted up clergy as the thing to follow. And so you're being part of the universal church, and your salvation was doing what you were told by the clergy. So the Gnostics kind of saw that as like a baby food approach to Christianity, where if you're just following what someone tells you to do so that you're not a sinner and you can go to heaven and all of that, you're not really thinking, you're not really feeling it, you're not really, doing the stuff. You're just like taking orders, and you're more of a drone in modern terms. It's not to say that the Orthodox were evil in having that view. They were, like Jill said, they were seeking unity. They were seeking a common way to identify themselves, come together in community. And they were looking for ways to define it so that it could be universally taught to everybody, and everybody could come to the same sort of idea. But that, again, was not enough for the Gnostics. So the Gnostics argued that when one truly knows themselves, they can recognize God and see the divine within them. And so they thought that the Orthodox believers did not seek after God enough. The fact that they just accepted what clergy said and no longer sought God, that to them was the problem. Whereas the Orthodox just wanted everybody to be there, do the church thing, and carry the institution on. The Gnostics were like, no, that's not good enough. It's not good enough. They wanted more. And in that way, I can relate, right?
I have a quick question, Amy. Mm-hmm. Did the Gnostic church have a hierarchy within their? I mean, it was really just a collective, I guess, or.
Well, what they had.
I'm sorry.
So what they had was, I mentioned Valentinius. He was one of the writers, and they had church leaders in the sense they had people. How she words is basically they were, the Orthodox saw them as elitist because they were saying that you have to have the secret inner knowledge in order, and the spiritual maturity. But they weren't being exclusive, actually. They were simply saying that anybody can be that if they seek God and ask the questions. and achieve spiritual maturity. And so they do believe in hierarchy in the sense of, if you are someone who has achieved a higher level of spiritual maturity, then you can share and teach that knowledge to other people to help them achieve spiritual authority. So whereas that's where they differed. Neither were exclusive. It's just that the Gnostics believed that, you know, if you were the one that got the spiritual maturity, then you are the one that should teach other people, so they can then teach other people and kind of spread it out from there. Whereas the Orthodox wanted to keep it in a central hierarchy that was very rigid and controlled, so that there can't be so many questions. Of course, that also bit them because they had disagreements within themselves. And so having a more rigid orthodoxy made it hard for them to move around in their own space. Does that answer your question? Cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions, thoughts, concerns? So then this is the last chapter, chapter 6. The question here, and they all kind of tie back and forth to each other. So, you know, when we go over the 6 questions, they all come back to very similar kind of viewpoints. But this question in chapter 6 is, why did the institutional church reject the idea of gnosis, which is knowledge of self, equals the knowledge of God? It's power, always power. And part of it, like we said, is, you know, trying to unify. But so one of the main reasons that Irenaeus rejected Gnostic thought was not because he disagreed with everything that they said, but more because the Gnostics rejected the authority of the church leaders, the creeds that they established, and the New Testament as they canonized it. So basically, they set up this institution, this structure, this hierarchy. This is what we believe. This is how we do it. It's all lined up, and now all you have to do is follow it. But the Gnostics, like I said about the last chapter, they're like, no, it's spiritual maturity. There's still growth. There's still things that we have to do better, and we have to grow over time. It's not a one and done deal. It's a lifetime journey, and it's a spiritual enlightenment, and it's, you know, you achieve fulfillment, you achieve a higher knowledge, higher consciousness. And even though there was diversity within the Gnostic movement, like I mentioned before, they did all tend to agree that they did not like the organization of authority or the exclusive leadership by men and martyrdom. So the Orthodox believe that God must be approached through divinely mandated method, meaning clergy, while Gnostics believe that humanity itself manifests divine life and divine revelation. And so some Gnostics rejected all church institution as a hindrance to their progress, but yet Valentinus willingly participated in church because he believed it was actually an instrument that could facilitate self-discovery. And then the Orthodox and Gnostics also diagnosed the human condition differently. In what I talked about before, the Orthodox agreed with Judaism that sin separates us from God. But can you guess what the Gnostics thought separated us from God if their desire is knowledge? Ignorance. And so what they said is that ignorance rather than sin causes human suffering and separates us from God. And that when we attain knowledge and that spiritual maturity, especially self-knowledge and insight, that is what helps us control our impulses. And so that's where I found it interesting, in that it ties to psychodynamics. You know, we talk about psychiatry and psychodynamics in our time. Self-knowledge is where you find your cure, right? You can find liberation and destruction within yourself. And so basically the Gnostics in that vein, they're like psychoanalysts of today, and they're they're saying basically that a creature of oblivion cannot experience fulfillment. And so they also point out that Christ himself is quoted as saying that the kingdom of God is within us in Luke. And so if you think about that, the kingdom of God is within us, which Christ said, and the Gnostics say internal knowledge of self helps us transform the world, because it isn't historic events, but it's internal transformation. And when each of us internally transforms and follows God in a deeper sense and grows spiritually, we become more connected to each other, and we can create change in the world, starting within ourselves and then carrying that out to love your neighbor as yourself. So they still have similarities to the Orthodox. They go in a different way, and they're more about being real and growing rather than just following along. So it could be someone who's like authoritarian versus people who just want to be told what to do because they don't want to think too much about it. So the Gnostics basically think if you're willing to just follow along, we call them sheeple nowadays, right? But they would just say that they just want to cling to being drunk. They just don't want to have to do the work. They're like, nah, I'm good.
Yeah. Well, I think too that the hierarchy of the Orthodox Church preferred people. People were illiterate, and it was
that's true too.
You're much easier to control. So as you're saying all of this now, Amy, I'm sitting here thinking that explains a lot as to why they were so feared and considered so heretical, in that puts a lot of responsibility on the individual and gaining knowledge and intelligence, and then you become questioning, and then you become less easy to control. And so I see now even more so that why they were so feared by the Orthodox.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's it. Questioners, we're a pain in the ass. Like, let's be real. We make it difficult. So let me read this last page of this.
And
Go ahead, DJ.
And I was just going to say that, and as we're asking questions, that is to gain knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And it all comes back down to knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And if you think about the fact that God created us to be relational, what is one of the biggest things that makes us be in relationship together better? Understanding.
No. Understanding, yeah.
And understanding is a form of gaining knowledge. Like, it's not
Right.
understanding like in an intellectual sense. It could be like emotional understanding. It could be experiential understanding. But yeah, I mean, that's how we bond with each other, is like, oh, I see you. I see who you are. I don't see my projection of you. I actually understand and see you. And that, brings us closer together than if we're just like, oh yeah, that person's whatever. And you just never really go past that. You just kind of, that's how labels and prejudice and all these other things get to be so common, because we don't take the time to understand someone's experience as being different from ours. We just project what we understand onto them. And that's not real knowledge. That's kind of like superficial stereotyping. So look, we tied it all the way back to the issues of today.
Right.
Well, I was going to say my Facebook, I've never thought I had friends on Facebook. I mean, I have some friends who are on Facebook, but I have found during these last 4 months that I have some friends that I met on Facebook, and it's because we've taken time to listen to each other and talk.
Absolutely.
As opposed to just expound. So.
So I'm going to read the last paragraph of chapter 6 as well, because basically it says some good things about the Orthodox Church as well. So obviously, such a program of discipline, what we were talking about, achieving enlightenment and doing the spiritual maturation and all of that, such a program of discipline, like the higher levels of Buddhist teaching, would appeal only to a few. Although major themes of Gnostic teaching, such as the discovery of the divine within, appealed to so many that they constituted a major threat to Catholic doctrine, the religious perspectives and methods of Gnosticism did not lend themselves to mass religion. In this respect, it was no match for the highly effective system of organization of the Catholic Church, which expressed a unified religious perspective based on the New Testament canon, offered a creed requiring the initiate to confess only the simplest essentials of faith, and celebrated rituals as simple and profound as baptism and the Eucharist. The same basic framework of doctrine, ritual, and organization sustains nearly all Christian churches today, whether Roman Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant. Without these elements, one can scarcely imagine how the Christian faith could have survived and attracted so many millions of adherents all over the world throughout 20 centuries. For ideas alone do not make a religion powerful, although it cannot succeed without them. Equally important are social and political structures that identify and unite people into a common affiliation. So basically what she's saying there is kind of what I was saying before. You know, the Gnostics had a certain level of privilege. You know, as Jill mentioned, people couldn't read. So if you can't read and you're a common person, you can't achieve that through your own knowledge, right? And so having a place of belonging and care in the church is still good. But I think that we're in a time now where it should be both and. You know, we can have the unifying thing and still question it and seek higher spiritual maturity while accepting the basics and the common and trying to bring people together. But, you know, each of us in our journey, then we can then take time to mentor and teach other people to help them achieve spiritual elevation as well. Because ultimately, we're seeing right now, I think what we're seeing right now is a time of spiritual elevation. In our time of questioning, like the way that things have always been, people are awakening to new consciousness. People are learning that, oh, I don't have it all figured out. And oh, that person's experience matters too. And that group of people matter too. And oh, wow, I didn't realize that by thinking this way that I was excluding so many. And, you know, and judging so many. So I think that, you know, it's all very complicated. So, and I do ultimately see the good is that no matter what we think or what we do, God is always working. And God is always working for our good, whether we go down the Orthodox path or the Gnostic path or a combination of the two. God is still with us, whether it's spiritual or physical or however our God images are, male, female, both and, multiple, singular. No matter what we as humans interpret from God, God is always seeking our good. And so I think that's what I come to. And for me, seeing the Gnostics, it just gives me more diversity in the faith that kind of can address some of the things that the faith has done wrong to us over the millennia. And so I think that imitates like how we're changing as people, like having one ideology can divide and conquer, whereas allowing space for people to go in their own little offshoots, it actually teaches us more and can help us grow together.
I agree.
Cool. So with all of that, I really wanted to give you guys an overview, just because like the questions that you had, the questions I had, she answers them so good in that book, you know, with like showing both sides. And I just, I never thought about specifically like what does, sometimes we don't ask the questions of why certain things matter so much. And so to see why they matter in political and social context and relational context, I think that's why it's always important to be able to study the outside texts and, question why do we believe what we believe? And I think that's very Gnostic of us to do that. And so we can still believe the Orthodox views and also question them and also grow in our faith and also grow in our understanding and peace and love of one another. And so that's kind of the hope that I've been bringing in studying these additional texts, is just so that we learn to ask better questions, and that we and that maybe we just don't take so much for granted about what has been told to us, so that we can help other people in the world heal, because we're all broken. We're all hurting, and we're all, the competition and the fighting and the selfishness and the seeking of power. I think that if we go deeper into the spiritual, it helps us with our physical as well. I see it as both and, not either or.